"Where's your thing, boy?" That's what Wade Halstead barked when he caught his newest ranch hand bathing in the river. But what he saw next wasn't just unexpected. It was impossible. The boy he'd hired, quiet, sharp-eyed, worked harder than most, wasn't a boy at all. And with that one moment, everything Wade thought he knew about trust, loyalty, and his own hardened heart began to unravel. This isn't just a Western. It's a reckoning. A fugitive woman in disguise. A man haunted by war and silence. And a secret that could burn everything down or build something new. Saddle up for one of the most tender, quietly powerful stories to rise out of the old frontier. Hit subscribe for more untold stories from the American West, where the land was harsh, but the hearts were harder. And sometimes, love found a way to ride through anyway. The wind rolled off the Rockies like a low growl, brushing the frostbitten pasture with a bitter breath. Wade Halstead stood near the split-rail fence of the southern corral, a silhouette of stillness beneath the pale morning sky. His coat hung open despite the bite in the air, and his boots, dust-scuffed and cracked, rooted him like one more post in the earth. He was a man carved from silence, one who'd seen enough war loss and prairie winters to stop expecting change. Then the rider came. From over the ridge, horse and figure emerged, no announcement, no dust cloud, just the quiet, deliberate rhythm of hoofs across cold ground. The horse was narrow-chested and bone-weary, its coat matted with old sweat. The rider, slight and hunched against the cold, wore a trail-stained hat, too wide for the head beneath it. No rifle, no saddlebag, just a bedroll and a length of braided rope. It was the kind of arrival that asked no questions and offered no answers. Wade squinted against the light. The rider swung down stiffly, favoring the left leg, and walked with a limp that looked old, like a story not worth retelling. At the fence, the stranger stopped short, eyes still hidden beneath the hat's brim. "I'm looking for work," came the voice, low, young, dry as sawdust. "Name's Kit. I handle horses, CC's." Wade didn't respond at once. He studied the posture, firm, not fidgety. The jawline sharp, but not yet hardened by years. The build was lean, not weak, strong like a rope stretched tight, not bulky like so many ranch hands. Yet there was something about the stillness. It was practiced, defensive. "You break?" Wade asked finally. Kit nodded once. "Break. Train, saddle, he's right." The voice didn't crack, didn't sell itself. It was the voice of someone who'd been turned away enough times not to beg. Wade tilted his head toward the barn. "Talk to Tommy. He'll get you started." Inside the barn, Tommy Kittredge was sorting tack hands raw, from the chill, humming a crooked tune he never remembered the words to. When the stranger appeared in the doorway, he paused mid-motion. The light behind cast the figure in silhouette, all straight lines and quiet. "You Halstead's man?" the stranger asked. Tommy nodded, brushing his palms on his vest. "That's me. You must be Kit." The figure stepped into the light. The face that emerged was narrow and pale beneath the trail dust, eyes large and dark beneath the wide-brimmed hat. There was a sharpness to them, like they saw more than they let on. "Wade said you'd show me around." "Sure," Tommy said suddenly, conscious of his own boots too big and muddy. "Yeah, come on then." They moved through the stalls and alleyways in a quiet rhythm, Kit trailing, but never stumbling, listening, but never interrupting. Tommy talked more than usual, not because Kit asked, but because the twins felt weighty. When he pointed to the old mare with the bad temper, Kit didn't flinch. When he handed him a curry comb, Kit worked with quiet precision, brushing from neck to flank in long, even strokes. Tommy found himself watching, then catching himself and watching again. There was something in the way Kit moved, not soft, but smooth. Not tentative, but deliberate. It wasn't like the other boys. Most new hands tried to prove something, made noise just to fill space. Kit was the opposite. He moved like he was used to going unseen. That night, Tommy lay in his bunk turning things over in his mind. He didn't know what he was feeling. Admiration, maybe. Curiosity, sure. But there was something else, something that knotted in his stomach when Kit brushed a stray strand of hair back behind his ear, with a motion too graceful for a farm boy. He turned over face to the wall, heart unquiet. Wade watched from a distance. From the rise near the north pasture, he saw Kit work through the day, gentle with the colts, firm with the stubborn ones, quiet always. And competent. Damned competent. But it wasn't just the skill that drew Wade's attention. It was the way the boy carried himself. Too quiet. Too clean. There was no slack in his motions, no wasted effort. Every movement spoke of a discipline, and that made Wade uneasy. Ranch work made a man rough. Kit was tempered, not warned. Wade had learned long ago that silence was seldom innocent. It either meant pain or danger or both. And this kid had a silence that wrapped around him like armor. Still, he couldn't help but feel the pull. Something in him stirred when he saw the boy leading the Mustang across the paddock, jaw-set body, taut like a bowstring. He told himself it was instinct, the same instinct that had kept him alive during the war. But part of him knew better. He saw the way Tommy glanced at Kit when he thought no one was watching, saw the way the boy lingered near, not close enough to be obvious, but close enough to be caught in the gravity of something he didn't understand. Wade felt it too. And though he didn't say a word, he knew already. Kit wasn't just another hand. He was a hinge. A turning point. Something was going to change. And Wade Halstead, who had once sworn he was done changing, stood on the edge of it, boots planted in cold ground, heart beginning to thaw. Tommy had always been good with people, good at making them talk, laugh, or at least nod back. But Kit was different. Every attempt at small talk was met with silence, or worse, a polite nod that felt like a closed door. Tommy tried anyway. He talked about the horses, the weather, the occasional coyote that crept too close to the chickens. Kit listened, sometimes nodded, never more. Tommy couldn't say why it bothered him. Maybe it was the way Kit never asked anything back, or the way she, as he would later learn, seemed to move just outside of reach, always just far enough to remain unknowable. There was a stillness to Kit that wasn't born of shyness. It was control, like someone keeping their breath measured so they wouldn't disappear into the panic behind it. Wade noticed too. He watched Kit in the same way he used to watch wounded animals, not with pity, but with a kind of wary curiosity. There was strength there, but it was wrapped in something fragile. Not weakness. Secrecy. Wade knew the look. He'd worn it once himself in the months after Gettysburg, when silence had been the only thing that made the screaming stop. It was late afternoon when he found himself riding along the North Trail, reins loose in his hand, not looking for anything in particular. The wind was soft, the light gold and slanting low. He liked that hour. It made the world quieter. Honest. He heard the water first, a soft bubbling from the stream that cut through the ravine. Then the voice. Not loud, just a hum. Almost tuneless, but steady. He dismounted quietly, tied his horse to a pine, and walked through the underbrush with the quiet steps of a man who'd once been hunted. As he neared the bank, he caught sight of Kit. She was waist-deep in the stream, bare, back to the sun, arms raised to scrub through dark hair that clung to her shoulders like wet silk. The flannel shirt was draped over a nearby rock. And there, plain, unmistakable, were the curves of a woman's form. Wade froze. Not just his body, but his mind. For a moment, the world seemed to pull tight around that one image. Kit, not the boy, but the girl. the woman. And all the silence, the distance, the odd softness, it made a terrible, perfect sense. His breath left him in a single exhale. A branch cracked beneath his boot. Kit spun around. She saw him. Her eyes went wide, body half submerged, arms crossing instinctively over her chest. Wade didn't speak. He didn't move. Neither did she. It was as if time folded between them, holding its breath. Then finally her voice low and shaking. "You saw." Wade nodded, slowly. His jaw worked once, twice before words came. "You lied." Kit stepped back until water reached her ribs. Her face was pale, eyes fierce. She trembled, but not from the cold. "I had to." Wade shook his head, more at the sky than at her. "You could have said something." Kit's voice rose, edged with fire. "And you would have let me stay. A girl alone asking for work out here." Wade looked at her, then really looked. Not at the body, but the eyes. The jaw set in defiance, the hands clenched in water like fists. "You don't know what I would have done," he said quietly. She looked away, teeth pressing into her bottom lip. Then softly, "I couldn't risk it." He let that hang in the air. Let the breeze and the burble of the stream fill the space between them. "Why are you running?" he asked at last. She hesitated. Then in a voice low and broken, "My stepfather, Otis McRae. He hurt my mother. Killed her. He wants me back. For what, I don't know. But I wasn't going to wait to find out." Wade's expression didn't change, but his hand tightened on the saddle horn beside his him. Otis McRae was a name he knew, and not one spoken lightly. Kit stepped from the water, grabbed the shirt, wrapped it around her with shaking fingers. She looked smaller now, younger, but the fire in her eyes remained. "So what now?" she asked. "You turning me in?" Wade stared a long moment, then shook his head. "You keep working. But the lies stop. Not to me. Not again." Kit swallowed, nodded. "Then we don't speak of it again," she said. "Deal," Wade said, turning back toward his horse. From the trees beyond the ridge, Tommy had seen them talking. Saw Wade stiff and silent, Kit wrapped in a damp shirt, hair clinging to her face. He couldn't hear the words, but the shape of the moment was clear. He didn't know what he felt. Not yet. But it sat heavy in his chest, something like betrayal. And jealousy too. Though he would never name it out loud. The knock came just after dawn, sharp and sure, the kind of knock that didn't ask permission so much as announce arrival. Wade Halstead stepped onto the porch, coffee in hand, steam curling past his unshaven jaw. On the yard below stood two riders. One he knew. The other wore shackles. Marshal Randall Dunn hadn't aged gracefully. The war had left lines in his face and suspicion in his gait. He dismounted with the stiffness of old scars and eyed Wade with something between familiarity and warning. "Wade Dunn," said, tipping his hat. "Randall." The man beside him was younger, taller, darker. High cheekbones, long braid shoulders, drawn back, not in pride, but in the resolve of someone who had stopped explaining himself to white men. His wrists were bound in iron. He didn't speak. "This one's Eli Bearskin," Dunn said. "Wanted out of Cheyenne. Man's dead. Witness says the Injun did it." Wade's eyes narrowed, not at the accusation, but at the chains. "Long ride to bring him here." Dunn shrugged. "Stopping through. Figured you had a cell in that old tack room." Wade said nothing, just nodded once. He didn't like it. But he'd known Dunn long enough to pick his battles. He turned to lead them around back. Kit saw them from the paddock. She dropped the brush in her hand and stood still as stone. Eli. She knew that face, those eyes. The man who had pulled her from the river 2 years ago, when McRae's men chased her through the high valley. He'd said nothing then, just wrapped her in a blanket and walked away. He'd saved her life. Now, he stood in irons. That night, the wind came down hard from the mountains, cold and cruel. Kit sat near the barn back against a hay bale, eyes fixed on the darkness. She hadn't spoken a word since morning. Tommy found her there, shoulders hunched, hat pulled low. "You all right?" he asked. She didn't answer. He sat beside her. "Close, too close. Been meaning to tell you something," he began. His hands shook, but not from the cold. "I know we haven't talked much, not the way maybe we should have. But I like you, more than I probably ought to." Kit didn't move. Tommy kept going, voice barely above a whisper now. "I don't know what it means, but I think about you. I watch you work, and it makes sense. Everything just makes sense." Then he saw it. Her shoulders trembled. A sound small and buoyant escaped her. Not words, a sob. "Kit." She turned her face, and in the dim lantern glow, he saw it, tears cutting tracks down her dust-streaked cheeks. Tommy reeled back as if struck. I didn't mean," he stammered, standing too fast, knocking over a pail. But Kit said nothing, just pulled her knees to her chest and turned her face away. Tommy fled. Into the cold, into the dark, into the confusion of a boy who had never known his own heart could mislead him so. He walked aimlessly through the pasture until the frost numbed his face, until his boots felt like stone. His thoughts were a blur, confusion, shame, and something else he dared not name. He thought of Kit's hands, the way they moved over a horse's flank. He thought of her eyes, always watching, but never inviting. And he thought of how those eyes had looked wet with tears. It had broken something in him. Was it betrayal of what? Of who she was? Or was it his own soul betraying the version of himself he had built here? Honest, clean, uncomplicated. He sat beneath a cedar tree and wept quietly like a boy who had dreamed too big. Meanwhile, Wade sat alone in the tack room, watching Eli through the bars. The man hadn't spoken all day, hadn't looked afraid, just waiting. "I've seen your kind before," Wade said quietly. "Not meaning your blood. I mean your eyes." Eli looked up, said nothing. "You've seen things. Same as me." Still silence. Then soft as snow on timber, Eli spoke. "I know the girl." Wade leaned forward. "How she ran. I helped. McCrae hunts her like coyote hunts doe." Wade's gut turned to iron. He stood, pacing now. "She says he killed her mother." Eli nodded. "He did. And more, Wade stared through the bars. "You can prove it, no. But I saw." Outside the tack room, Kit stood in shadow, unseen. She had come to ask about Eli, to find the man who once saved her, to know if he remembered. But she heard everything. She leaned against the wall, tears drying on her face. A memory stirred, muddy riverbank, breathless terror, the warm wool of a blanket wrapped by calloused hands. She had survived, but she had never felt safe. Now behind this barn wall, she heard a truth she had long buried, return to her like thunder in the bones. The war had never ended. Not for her, not for Eli, not for Wade. In the distance, dawn was still hours away, but already the wind spoke of reckoning. And all across the ranch, silence pressed in, like a hand upon the throat of morning. The morning came cold and colorless. A sky stretched thin over the ranch, like the underbelly of a dead thing. Snow had fallen overnight, thin and dry, barely a whisper over the hard-packed earth, but enough to dull sound and sharpen every breath. The kind of day that carried a hush, as if the land itself were waiting. Wade Halstead stood near the tack room door, one hand resting on the worn iron latch, the other wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold. Inside, Randall Dunn's voice was a growl, low and mean. The kind of sound that didn't rise in pitch, only in cruelty. Kit had come before sunrise. Her boots barely left tracks in the new snow. She hadn't knocked, just stood there, eyes wild, coat too thin, voice shaking. "He's hurting him," she said. "Eli, you have to stop it." Wade hadn't answered. Not right away. Because a part of him, some old soldier part, understood Dunn. Understood the need to break men who wouldn't talk. But there was another part too. A quieter one. The part that had watched Kit walk the barnyard with quiet steps and unseen bruises. That part was harder to ignore now. Inside the tack room, Eli's voice cracked a hoarse grunt, followed by the dull sound of a fist on flesh. Kit flinched. "Please," she whispered. Wade cursed under his breath, tossed the coffee into the snow. Then he opened the door. "Enough," he said, voice like gravel. Dunn looked up, hands still clenched. His face twisted. "Man's hiding something. He'll keep hiding it if you break him." Wade stepped in, put a hand on Dunn's arm. It wasn't a request. Dunn hesitated, then lowered his fist. Eli slumped against the post, blood at the corner of his mouth, looked up at Wade with the barest flicker of gratitude, then looked away. Outside, Kit stood trembling. Wade walked past her, said nothing. But she followed. Later that day, Tommy moved through the barn with a quietness that wasn't natural to him. Since the night before, something in him had twisted, and no amount of chores could untangle it. He hadn't spoken to Kit, had barely looked at her. And yet he found himself near the hayloft again, near the old side room where Kit sometimes changed. He wasn't thinking. Not really. Just moving on instinct. Then he saw. The door was open a crack. Inside, Kit had her back-turned, shirt half off the curve of her waist, unmistakable hair unbound and falling in waves down her spine. For a moment, Tommy's mind refused to believe what his eyes screamed. Then Kit turned just slightly and saw him. Their eyes met. Neither moved. Tommy's breath caught in his throat. He backed away, nearly stumbling, then turned and left without a word. He didn't speak to anyone that day. Not to Wade. Not to the other hands. Not even to Kit. But something inside him cracked. That night, Tommy lay awake in the bunkhouse, staring at the beams above him. The snow outside had thickened, a slow fall that muffled the world. He thought of Kit, her silence, her strength, her secrets, and now her truth. He couldn't hate her, couldn't even feel betrayed, just hollow. Like something precious had slipped through his fingers, something he'd never fully held. In the morning, he brought her coffee. Didn't say a word. Just set it down by her saddle blanket and walked away. Kit looked after him, unsure. But she drank it. The next day he fixed the loose plank in her stall. The day after that, he led her mare to water when she was busy mucking. He said nothing. She said nothing. But between them, a fragile understanding began to settle. Tommy never told anyone what he'd seen. Not even himself. Not in words. But from that moment on, he became her shadow, quiet, steady, loyal in a way that cost him more than he knew how to name. He didn't call it love. Didn't dare. But it was something close. Something like goodbye. Kit lay awake that night, curled beneath a fraying quilt in the corner of the hayloft. She listened to the wind sigh through the rafters, the creak of wood settling in the cold. Tommy's quiet kindness unsettled her more than his gaze ever had. He had seen. She knew that now. And yet, he had protected her silence. A tear slipped from her eye, dried before it reached her cheek. She didn't know what he wanted or why it mattered. But somehow it eased something brittle inside her, the feeling of being hunted alone. He hadn't asked her to explain. He'd simply stayed. And in a world where nothing was given without cost, that kindness felt heavier than stone. Wade stood out by the fence-line collar, upturned, a cigar smoldering in one hand. The wind bit at his face, but he didn't feel it. He was watching the yard, the bunkhouse light, the faint movements in the barn beyond. He didn't trust Dunn, didn't trust the quiet between breaths. Something was coming. He could feel it in the frost, in the way the horses shifted more than usual, ears twitching at shadows. His thoughts turned to Kit, to the trembling in her voice when she'd begged for Eli, to the resolve in her back as she walked away. He didn't know what kind of man that made him, choosing her over law, over habit. But he knew one thing: he wasn't sorry. Something had changed. Not just in her, in him. And now, in the hush of snow and starlight, he understood what few men ever admitted, that sometimes the war doesn't end when the bullets do. Sometimes it ends when a man chooses not to draw his gun. But he also knew some fights still waited. Some blood had yet to be spilled. They came with the wind. At first just dust rising on the horizon, thin amber in the dawn light, barely a smudge against the stillness. But Wade Halstead knew the shape of danger. He felt it in the way the crows rose too soon from the pines, in the way the dogs refused to bark. Otis McCrae rode at the head. His black coat flared like smoke behind him, and his wide-brimmed hat cast a long shadow across his cruel smile. Beside him, half a dozen men, rifles slung, eyes dead. They fanned out as they approached the yard. Wade stood on the porch, shotgun resting over one shoulder, Kit at his side. Eli behind the tack room, eyes narrowed. Tommy just off the barn, pistol in hand, and hands shaking. "They won't ask questions," Wade said low. "They didn't come for talk." Kit didn't blink. "Then we don't waste breath." McCrae's voice cut the cold morning like a whip. "You've been hiding my property, Halstead, and I aim to take her back. She's no one's property." That's so McCrae dismounted. The snow crunched beneath his boots. Then maybe it's time she hears the rest of the story. Like how Wade Halstead was riding with the Blue Devils back when we torched that valley, including the shack her mama died in. Kit froze, turned, looked at Wade. Her face cracked with disbelief. "No," Wade said. "What? But for me, we were sent to chase raiders. We didn't know civilians were in the line. We didn't light the flame. But you stood and watched it burn," McCrae sneered. A memory burst in Kit's mind. Her mother screaming in smoke, the smell of burning pine, the sound of men shouting outside. A soldier's voice barking orders. Her small hand clutched by trembling fingers, then letting go. Rage and horror surged like wildfire. Then the first shot rang out. Chaos broke like a thunderclap. Eli opened fire from the shadows. Tommy, startled but brave, ran to Kit's side. Bullets cut through the morning air like bees in a storm. Horses screamed. Snow kicked up in red plumes. One of McCrae's men ducked behind a hay cart and returned fire. Another slipped behind the barn, flanking. Wade called out, "Left side," just before Eli took a hit to the arm and staggered. Kit fired twice, her aim tight, face stone, but missed. She dropped behind a trough, reloading with trembling fingers. Wade hit one man square in the chest. Another ran. A thug came out of the smoke near Kit, rifle raised. Tommy saw. He didn't think, just moved. He tackled the man hard. They went down in the snow, but not before the rifle fired. The bullet caught Tommy high in the shoulder. He gasped, rolled away, blood blooming red and fat. "Tommy!" Kit cried. She dropped beside him, pressed her hand to his wound, but McCrae was coming. Gun raised. Smile wicked. A demon from her past, walking steady through gunfire. Something broke in her. Not fear. Something older. A final thread. She stood. The revolver in her hand felt heavy but right. She took aim. Just once. Just enough. The shot cracked. McCrae staggered, a red bloom on his chest. He stumbled forward a step, then collapsed face first in the snow. Silence fell. The last man dropped his weapon. The others fled into the trees. Kit stood frozen, gun still raised. Then Wade was there, arms around her, pulling her in. "It's over," he whispered. "You did it." Her body shook, but not from cold. Tommy groaned behind them. Kit turned, ran to him. "I'm all right," he gasped. "Just a scratch." She held his hand, pressed it to her chest. Eli limped over, blood trailing from his sleeve. He looked down at McRae's body, then to Kit. "I told you once, girl," he said quietly. "You'd have to do the killing yourself." Kit nodded. Tears streamed silently. "I know." Wade turned away from them a moment, looked toward the woods, the trail where the men had fled. The rising sun painted gold across the tree line. A peace settled over the ranch, like stoic, fragile, uncertain, but real. Later in the barn, as Wade wrapped Tommy's wound, and Kit sat nearby in silence, she turned to Wade. "Is it true?" she asked. "What he said about you?" Wade nodded, not meeting her eyes. "I was there, and I've lived with that weight ever since." Kit looked down, voice soft. "It wasn't you that lit the fire, but you stayed." "I did," he whispered, "and I'll carry that shame until the day I die." She didn't respond, but she didn't walk away. Outside, the wind had stilled. The dogs had stopped pacing. The war for now had ended. And for the first time, Kit felt something she hadn't dared name in years: safety. Not from guns, not from fire, but from the kind of love that didn't ask to be earned, just offered, freely. Dunn died before the third day's sunrise. The wound had festered overnight, though no one had seen it bleed. He'd taken a stray bullet to the gut, sometime in the fight, hidden beneath that black duster of his pride, stitching his lips shut when pain should have spoken. They found him curled behind the feed shed, breath rattling, face pale and waxen. Wade knelt beside him. The others stood back. Even death, it seemed, had waited for silence. Dunn looked at Wade through half-lidded eyes, old fear worn down to something simpler. "I always thought I was right," he murmured. "That men like Eli had no place, that girls who ran were just trouble waiting." Wade said nothing. Dunn coughed. Blood stained his chin. "But I was wrong. 'Bout him. 'Bout her. 'Bout you." His hand trembled, reached for nothing, then fell. The wind picked up as his last breath faded. No thunder, no glory, just the hush of frost moving across wood. They buried him behind the stables near the cottonwood. No one prayed aloud, but Kit laid a single stone atop the mound. That was enough. By noon, Eli was packed, his arm in a sling, his face tired. He stood at the edge of the yard with Wade. "You sure you want to go?" Wade asked. Eli nodded. "I've stayed too long in white men's wars." They looked out toward the low ridge, where the land rolled into tall grass and stone. "I can't make things right," Wade said, "but I can give back what I stole." He held out a parchment, signed, sealed. A deed. 30 acres on the northern boundary. Forest water piece. Eli took it, folded it carefully. "It won't fix what's broken," no, Wade said, "but it's a start." They clasped arms, not in forgiveness, but in truth. Kit approached slowly. Her voice was soft. "Thank you. For back then. For now." Eli nodded. "You'll do funny, but don't lose that fire." Kit's smile was brief but real. Then Eli walked, without looking back. In the bunkhouse, Tommy stirred. Kit was there as she'd been all night. She sat on the stool, hands clasped, eyes rimmed red. His eyelids fluttered. "Kit." She moved fast, kneeling beside him, brushing damp curls from his brow. "I'm here. You're all right. You made it." He smiled, weak, but real. "You shot that bastard, didn't you?" She nodded, eyes brimming. Tommy looked at her, not the way he once had, but softer now, calmer. "I don't need you to love me," he whispered. "Just needed to know I was right to trust you." She gripped his hand. No words, just gratitude burning between them. She sat by his side the rest of that morning, long after he drifted to sleep again, her fingers still wound in his. That night, Wade sat with Kit on the porch. The stars hung heavy above them, and the moon lit the snowy pasture in a wash of silver. All was still. Even the cattle had ceased their lowing, as if they too understood the finality of things. Kit pulled the blanket tighter. Wade offered his arm, and she leaned in. "We could leave," he said. "Head west. No one would find us." She looked up. "And run again," Wade sighed. "It's what I know. Then maybe it's time to learn something else." He smiled, tired, but warmed. They sat in silence, listening to the wind trace the eaves. "No more running," she said at last. And Wade, who'd ridden with ghosts who'd stood in fire, and a silence, nodded. "No more," he agreed. As they sat there, Kit's mind drifted back to the day she'd first arrived. A dust-covered rider on a thin mare, the world at her heels. She remembered the fear, the grit in her mouth, the way the ranch had loomed like a fortress. And now it still stood. But it no longer loomed. It welcomed. The ranch wasn't much, just wood and earth and labor. But it was theirs. And for the first time, it felt like a home worth defending. Behind them, the lamp inside flickered low. But outside, the stars held steady. And the night, long and quiet, did not feel like an end but a beginning. The thaw had come early that spring. By late March, the creeks had begun to sing again, carrying away the last brittle traces of winter. The land no longer held its breath. The hills rolled out soft and green, the cottonwoods bursting with new buds, and the air, crisp, sweet, smelled faintly of wild violets and warm soil. Kit stood in the yard at dawn, the hem of her dress brushing the tops of her boots. It was simple blue calico, cinched at the waist, but it might as well have been stitched from starlight. Her hair, unbraided, hung free down her back. The wind caught it as she turned, and it moved like the sunlight. Wade stood by the hitching post, saddling her mare. He looked up as she approached, and for a moment, he didn't move. "You sure you're ready for this?" he asked. Kit grinned. "I've worn a saddle longer than a skirt. I think I'll manage." He smiled back, slow, deep. "It suits you." She mounted with the ease of a lifetime, gathering her skirts with practiced grace. They rode side by side down the trail that wound through the pasture, the racing sun casting golden slants through the slats of the fence. She hadn't worn a dress in 5 years. She hadn't let her hair fall in longer. But that morning, with the world waking gently around them, she felt no need to hide. Not from him, not from the land, not from herself. Tommy left before the trees bloomed. He packed light. No fanfare, no drawn-out goodbyes. Just a firm handshake with Wade, a long look shared with Kit, and a promise scribbled into the margin of his journal. He joined a group heading west, homesteaders, dreamers, folk who believed that what lay beyond the mountains might still be untouched by blood and memory. On the trail out of the valley, he turned once, just once. Kit stood on the porch, arms wrapped around herself, the morning wind teasing at her skirts. She raised one hand. He touched the brim of his hat, and then he was gone. In his saddlebag, tucked beside a pocket knife and an old compass, was a pressed wildflower she'd once dropped beside the corral, and with it, the faintest trace of her laughter. He would carry it the rest of his days, not as regret, but as proof that he had once known her. That afternoon, Wade took her riding higher into the hills. The snow still lingered on the northern slopes, stubborn and gleaming beneath the sun. They crested a ridge just as light broke across the valley. He dismounted first, offered her a hand. She took it. Together, they stood in the hush of spring, the only sounds the distant call of a hawk and the soft shifting of hooves in snow. Wade turned to her, something unreadable in his eyes. "I never asked," he said. "Not really. Never pressed. Never needed to." She tilted her head. "Your name," he continued. "The one before Kit." She looked down at her boots, then out over the valley. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but clear. "Catherine," she said. "Catherine Rose McCrae." Wade stepped closer. His voice was low. "Catherine." She closed her eyes. That name, once a chain, now felt light as air. "I thought I'd lost her," she whispered. "That girl. That name. You didn't," Wade said. "You just buried her until the world was ready." They stood like that, wrapped in the high quiet of mountain light, until the cold gave way to warmth again. The story does not end there, of course. Fences would need mending. Calves would be born. The seasons would turn. But something in the earth had shifted. Something in the air felt new. And far above the valley, past the jagged teeth of the snowy peaks, the sun climbed steady, and golden spilling light across the land like a benediction. Not everything broken could be rebuilt, but some things could be begun. And her name was Catherine. You rode in, wearing a name that wasn't yours. A boy's name, a coat 2 sizes too big, and a heart full of things too dangerous to speak. You lied to survive. And yet, you found truth in the most unlikely place, in the calloused hands of a man who'd lost everything, and in the silence of a ranch that finally felt like home. But now, the dust has settled. The shooting's done. And someone, him, calls you by your real name again. Catherine. If you were her, would you still run, or would you stay, even knowing how much it hurts to be seen?